Welcome to another episode of Witty CFB. Your host, Rob Sheply here. On today's episode, we're going to be doing another deep dive into the Auburn Tigers, particularly discussing the status of Hugh Freeze and what exactly we should be looking forward to with Auburn, and exactly how hot is Hugh Freeze's seat going into this game versus Georgia this weekend. Now they're 2-3. They started off the season beating Alabama A&M. Then they beat then they lost to UCal, beat New Mexico, and then lost two heartbreakers against Arkansas and Oklahoma. And watching Auburn this past season for the most part, I think you can make a very strong, compelling argument that they should be 5-0 right now. I mean, the thing about Auburn right now is, although a lot of the attention is on Peyton Thorne and Hank Brown, and some of the comments that Hugh Freeze has said pretty consistently, such as implicating the players, kind of throwing them under the bus, and also the wild quote before the Arkansas game, which was, in essence, oh, I love Sam Pittman. I hope he wins the rest of his games this year, and he's a great coach. I think we beat him 9 times out of 9, and that's pretty ballsy for him to say that, given the status of the Auburn football program right now. Now, before I get into this, I just want to preface a couple of things. I think first and foremost, I think Hugh Freeze accepted this job under some very difficult circumstances. They've had three coaches in the past 4 seasons. Brian Hartson essentially gutted the program, and Hugh Freeze was essentially starting from ground zero. I mean, you had 49 something transfers coming in and out. You've had a lot of just transition in general. And I think this is one of those times where, in general, when Auburn did hire Hugh Freeze, fans were excited. I know I was definitely excited because, he was with Liberty for a while and then Ole Miss before. So I think everybody in general, objectively speaking, was definitely excited to see Hugh Freeze back in the SEC, even though he does tend to rattle some cages from time to time. But with that said, I mean, the thing right now with Auburn is, I think, although their record's 2-3, and quite frankly, they've lost games in so many different ways. I mean, you think of Oklahoma last weekend, they got outscored 17-0 versus Oklahoma in the fourth quarter, and then you have Payton Thorne who throws a pick six to lose the game. And I definitely want to add too that Auburn had 480 yards of offense versus Oklahoma, and we've definitely given a lot of praise to Brent Venables. I think he's an outstanding coach, and I do think eventually he is definitely the guy there. But there was so much hype surrounding this Oklahoma defense, and I definitely think it does tend to be a little bit short sighted sometimes in terms of how much Auburn's offense in general has been successful and productive in certain aspects. I mean, granted, you watched the Arkansas game and it was pretty ugly, where there was essentially 4 turnovers back and forth with each other. Now, I think the argument can definitely be made at the time that, like, yes, they had to make the move and throw in Hank Brown in there, who is the true freshman, but then eventually they got to a point where they just realized, like, hey, we need Payton Thorne. He's the more experienced guy. Came out of Michigan State, and you know, and I even mentioned this in my dive about Auburn a couple weeks ago. Was at the end of the day, Auburn did not decide to get a quarterback in the transfer portal, and they also refused to address that offensive line as well. I think that's one issue that I think also tends to go a little bit under the radar in terms of this Auburn program. Is I think even if there was a little bit of a better offensive line, I think we'd be having a little bit of a different conversation, because as much as Payne Thorne and Hank Brown have definitely, are the catalyst as to why Auburn is leading the country in turnovers right now, it's at the same time, I do think there are other elements involved right now that's making Auburn look worse than they actually are. Because if you really look at it full circle, I mean, the UCal game, the UCal game and the Oklahoma game are both games that they quite frankly should have won. I think the only game that I think you can sit there and say, well, I think they kind of one fair and square was the Arkansas game, but I think we can all objectively say that there's very good reason why they can be 5-0 because especially in those last couple of moments too, like Auburn's defense is just consistently just kind of falling apart too. It's always something. I feel like it's always something different every week. Like last week it was the pick six versus Arkansas was just just the defense and the secondary falling apart, and then with UCal it was just wasn't able to get any sort of aerial attack whatsoever. So when you kind of combining all these things together, it definitely leaves you a cause for concern. But in terms of Hugh Freeze, I mean, I do think that, you know, Hugh Freeze calling plays again, I do think is a really big deal. And I believe in general that he's put his players in the best possible chance to succeed in many different ways. However, I do think Hugh Freeze kind of has to tone it down a little bit in terms of what he's saying to the media and just quite frankly, just some of the brazen comments that he's said in general. It's definitely one of those things where, hey, I get it. You're 3-6 in SEC play right now. You really haven't had that sort of marquee win that Deion Sanders, for example, got this past weekend against UCF, or Mark Stoops had a really strong win versus Ole Miss, or you're at the point where you know it's right now it's one of those things where you know Hugh Freeze has kind of said over and over again, hey, we need to be you need us to be patient a little bit. And year two was kind of that year where it was sort of built as a thing where the rebuild was going to be a little bit slower, but also he kind of finds that balance between, okay, like I need patience, but I'm also gonna sit there and say, hey, we're just gonna try to get a bunch of high school recruits and go that way too, because for the most part too, I mean Auburn is playing a lot of young players this season, and I mentioned that before. I mean the team really is looking pretty fresh compared to the teams that we saw in the past season or two. But in general, I do think that Hugh Freeze definitely is the guy for this job. I mean, they cannot afford to. I mean, I'm sure if they really had to, they could, but obviously, you don't really want to sit there and pay another buyout to another coach too. And quite frankly, if you were to fire Hugh Freeze, what message are you sending? What message are you sending to the next person who takes that job? Because you canned Hartson, you canned Malzahn. Like what else you gonna there's only so many different directions you can go. But moving forward, when you think about this season, I mean, it's gonna be hard for them to get past 4 or 5 wins this year. I mean, think about it. You have Georgia on your you have Georgia on your schedule still, and then you travel to Mizzou, you travel to Kentucky. Again, I've talked about them, Kentucky, on the show multiple times. They're just a tough, gritty team with Mark Stoops, who well disciplined, well coached, very likable guy. And then you also have Vanderbilt. Don't sleep on them with Diego Pavia, who's a dog, and he's one of those guys that he's willing to take over a game too with his feet, and he's done a lot better with being able to spread the ball out and really get all of his receivers involved. And after that, you have Louisiana Monroe, Texas A&M, and then you finish off with the Iron Bowl. So when you sit there, to me, the two most plausible wins that you have right there are Kentucky and Louisiana Monroe, and that gets you to 4-8. I mean, Kentucky, yeah, Kentucky's definitely a winnable game, but at the same time, it is really kind of a difficult place to really win and be able to get there too, because at the same time too, this is kind of the catch 22 is Auburn has a lot of young playmakers, particularly the wide receiving core. So it's definitely one of those things where I think this team just needs a little bit more time to gel. And I think Hugh Freeze really needs more time to kind of really get his footprint on the program. And I think if we looked at this, I think even looking at this now, the expectation for Hugh Freeze when he was coming in here anyway was this has to be a minimum of a 3-year build, because especially with the foot the way of the land that it is now. I mean, you have Texas and Oklahoma in there too. And, when you're kind of in that balance between, you want to kind of be on the next echelon of teams, but at the same time, you have the resources, you have the the backing of everything, but at the same time too, it's one of those things where it's just simply not going to be done overnight. And although Hugh Freeze definitely isn't helping himself with some of the things that he's been saying off the field, they've had a lot of opportunities to win these games, and quite frankly, they are playing better than their 2-3 record suggests. It's just one of those things where, can Hugh Freeze get one really legitimate complete game out of Peyton Thorne? Do I think they have any shot at beating Georgia? Not really. But if we can even just see a complete game out of Peyton Thorne by, for example, limiting the turnovers, still finding your receivers, setting up Payne Thorne in a way where he can still make the right reads, get his confidence back up, get the run game more involved, and really try to put as little pressure on this offensive line. Because at the end of the day, those explosive plays of, going deep downfield aren't going to be there with this type of offensive line that they have right now. And the defense, for the most part, has been solid. They're not nothing spectacular with them in particular, but at the same time, too, I do think that they definitely deserve some credit too. I mean, at the end of the day, DJ Durkin, I think was a fantastic hire, one that definitely kind of goes under the radar in general. So when you look at this team full circle, I do think that Hugh Freeze definitely is the right guy for the job. They're going to have to stay patient a little bit. I think it's another great move that he's still calling the plays. And when you have a guy like DJ Durkin, somebody of his caliber on the defensive side of the ball, you can definitely trust that he's going to be able to put you in a situation where where no matter what's kind of going on in the game, you're still going to be there in some capacity too. So when I look at this Auburn team, I think although there's a lot of frustrations, a lot of just head scratching decisions by some of the decisions that some of the players have made, and some of the reads and the decisions and all that, I do think that for the most part it is pretty coachable. I do think Hugh Freeze has what it takes to turn around this program, and based on looking at everything full circle, it's just one of those things where we're not only you better off giving him more time, but I do think moving forward, it is the best thing to do for this program.